and welcome back to my channel, Bella Graffito Art. Here we are all about exploring and experimenting with different types of art, even if you know nothing about the materials. Last time we had talked about the watercolor class in a bag that I have through my website. This video is to help guide you through some of those watercolor materials, but even if you don't purchase that bag of materials, it is still a great video to watch so that way you can see some of the different types of watercolor that are out there that you might not be aware of. So stay tuned and let's get into it. Let us first talk about some techniques. So I want you to feel comfortable whenever you're starting out with any media. So I will always reference different books that I have that I started out with to help you out. This book, I bought it, I think either Amazon or Half Price Books forever ago. Please look through Half Price Books and find all sorts of different reference books that you can use to help you along if you want to dig deeper. But one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was getting started with your paper. If you've seen anything like this about stretching your paper, don't worry, you don't have to do this as a beginner, okay? So usually what you would do is you would wet down the paper, you'd get some gum tape, you would tape it to a surface so that way, you know, the paper could be stretched. You would let the paper dry, and then you could go ahead and start painting on it. Do I do this in my own artwork? Absolutely not, because I'm a chaotic artist and that's just my vibe. So I don't always do this. I don't even have the gum tape. I end up using just good old painter's tape when I'm making my own artwork. So I'm telling you this to let you know that there is more than one way to approach working with the watercolor, okay? Now, I will say one of the things that I really like in books like this is it does kind of open a world up of, you know, oh my gosh, there's all these different ways I can work with the media, but I just don't want you to get bogged down and think that you should be creating something like this your first try. That's not gonna happen. And we're kind of coming from more of a exploratory angle with this, so don't let the books make you think there's only one way of doing it. But I do want you to think about different ways of working with the brushes and different marks that you can make. Mark making is super important, and I want you to just explore with the different ways you can make marks with the watercolor. So you've got watercolor in that kit, pan watercolor, you've got watercolor pencils, you've got the watercolor brush markers. So you've got a lot of really cool different marks that you can end up using. Later on, these marks can translate into something a little more concrete if you really want to do something like flowers or you're trying to do landscapes, something like that. I just want you to focus on getting started, all right? So please browse the books if you want to at Half Price Books or even at Barnes & Noble, wherever. Browse the books, but don't make you feel like, okay, the books that I have to do this, so this is what I have to do. That's not necessarily the case, okay? So the first thing we're going to start off with is relatively easy. It's the watercolor palette, and I'm actually going to use my personal one because I want you to see how much I actually use this thing. First things first, you can decide if you want to fully wet your paper or not. Some people will think, oh my God, she's not going to wet the whole paper and she's working with watercolor. It depends on what you want to do. Also, I'm going to use this whole paper for different techniques, so I don't want the whole paper wet right now, all right? I'm just going to do little sections. So I'm going to start off with a larger round brush first. And because the watercolor palette is not wet yet, you do need to wet your brush first, okay? So I've got my little cup of water off camera there. So I'm going to start with like this purple color so that way it shows up. And this is what you're going to get on just dry paper, okay? Ooh, we can even fade it out a little bit, all right? That's just being on dry paper. Now, I'm going to grab this flat brush and just get some water. And I'm going to puddle up a little bit of water here. We're going to go back and get more of this purple, and then we're going to go into the wet. So see, now things look different on wet paper, the color kind of disperses out a little bit more when you're going into paper that's wet. Now this is more of a puddle. It's not like a damp spot. So if this were damp, it wouldn't spread out as much. But again, I want you to experiment. This nice smoothness that's happening here, this is really nice on dry paper, okay? But again, you're gonna play around with it a little and see what you want to do with your paint and with your brushes. So I'm gonna get some color on this flat brush, and we can just make some marks like this to just show that's what happens on dry paper, okay? And I'm going to overlap on top of this purple too. So now that's when something is dry, okay? See how it just goes right on top of it. Now, if I want to go ahead and go, I'm just wetting my brush a little bit more. If I want to go back into this damp area, again, it's going to spread. Okay, so that is with using pan watercolor. So one of the things you can also do with pan watercolor, and on your little card, on the little card in the kit, it does have a little thing in here about some watercolor ideas. And one of the top ones is about doing a night sky and having a tree line. That's what it would look like here, okay? So if you wanted to do something like this, you would want the paper to be wet so that way you could move these colors around and you would have them blend into each other, okay? So that's more of what a wet watercolor paper will do. So watercolor is just all about controlling how much water is going with the color. When you're working with the pan watercolor or any watercolor, always remember the amount of water you add is what is going to change. So if you get a color and you want it to be a little lighter, you're just going to add more water. So you might not want to flood this whole pan here. Say you wanted to use this orange. So a good thing you can do is use the lid. Remember I told you before when we were in the last video that when this opens, you can just pop this lid off. And that's what I always do on mine. I just pop it right off. But you can take the lid off and this can now be a palette. So if you wanted some of this orange here, but you wanted to add more water to it, you could just dunk your brush in the water, get some of this orange, and you can kind of squeeze the brush out a little bit in here, and then just keep adding water to this to water down the color instead of having this whole pan here be flooded with color. So again, this would just be separate, okay? I would keep it detached from this. I would just pop it right off. It's so much easier that way. So that way you have this kind of free to work with. And again, it pops easily right back on. So when you store it, of course, dry the paint out of there, out of the top of the lid before you close this up and put it away. The next thing you're going to want to experiment with is your brush markers that are in here. So the brush markers, these are actually going to be different colors that you get in the kit, if you get the kit. And they actually feel just like a paintbrush. So if you open one of these and you can kind of look at the tip a little bit, it looks just like a paintbrush and it works just like a paintbrush. Now, these work best when they have some water with them. See how it's more of a dry brush technique when you don't have the water there with it. I'm going to get my round brush here. I'm going to put water on the paper. I'm going to let that soak in a little bit. And then I'm going to show you what happens whenever you put the brush marker on top. So this is great to show you a dry brush technique. You can do the same with the pan watercolor if you gently wet the watercolor, but you don't wet your brush. Then you would get this kind of dry brush technique here. Now, if our paper is already wet a little bit, I can still do the brush marker on top. It's going to lighten the color. You're not ruining your brush marker. It's just going to lighten the color out, okay? Some people get freaked out about messing up their brush, and so they'll go in in the water and they're like, oh, yay, oh my gosh, I'm using this brush marker, and they're just going everywhere. And then they try to paint again and they're like, it's not working, and start freaking out. They cap it and then shake it too hard like this. And then you end up with watercolor down in your cap, okay? So I don't want this to happen to you. If it does, it is such an easy fix. You can just grab like a Kleenex and wipe around it. This is stuff some people don't tell you. They think everything's going to be just all fine and perfect when you start. No, it's not. You're going to have some whoopsies that happen. So twist it and then put it in the cap. See, and then we're just soaking up the extra watercolor. And it's fine. You didn't mess anything up, okay? We're going to make whoopsies along the way. I want to show you stuff that messes up because not everything's going to be perfect when you first start out, all right? Now, these are not super expensive brush markers. You might find brush markers that are crazy expensive. If you want to try them, then go for it. But you don't have to. You don't have to get super, super expensive markers. Now, I have some watercolor brush pens that I have that I used a coupon on because I'm not paying full price for that. They were super expensive, but I ended up getting a crazy good coupon and I bought them. And they're really nice watercolor brush pens, but I never would have bought them without a coupon. So you decide what your budget is and what you want to purchase. It's your money, okay? You do what you want. Now, I've made this little streak, these few streaks down here, so I can show you what happens when you run a wet brush through this, okay? So this is my flat brush. It's already got water in it. So we're just kind of dragging the color through. So see how you can blend it a little bit, but see how you can still see your brush marks? That's because with these brush pens, if you want to get that nice faded look, it really is better to start with like some damp paper first. Not super wet, just damp. You can get like a sponge and kind of wet your paper. You can get something like this little spray bottle that I showed in the other video that I've used a lot. You can use this to kind of damp your paper a little bit and spritz, and then start using the brush markers. But damp paper really does work best with these. So I'm going to try this with the round brush too at the bottom so you can see. Now, it's hard to blend because the watercolor has already started to stain the paper and get into those paper fibers. So that's why it's going to be difficult to just go straight onto the paper and then try to use the wet brush to blend everything out. Again, this is something that changes from watercolor marker to watercolor marker. Some will be really easy to blend out and some won't. So let me show you an example of that, of one that will blend really easily. These are some of the brush pens I was talking about that can get to be pretty pricey, but I had saved up for these and I also had a coupon, and that's the only way I was able to afford these. But I've had them for quite a while and they're super fun to work with. They're what I would call a really juicy brush pen. Also, the tip of these is not like a brush. So it's more of almost like a felty type tip to it. But these have like so much more pigment in them. And I found that seems to be the case with markers that have more of a felt end as opposed to markers that are more like the paintbrush. Because again, this is trying to mimic an actual paintbrush. So I want you to be aware that there's going to be two different types of brush markers. You're going to have the ones that are just like a paintbrush, where if you look at the very tip of it, it's going to look like it's bristles of a paintbrush. Then you have ones like this that are more of a flexible tip for the brush pen, and you get something more like this. So you don't actually get like a brush situation. It's more of like a marker situation. Another brush pen you may have seen are these Tombow dual brush pens. These are super popular and people use them for calligraphy as well as watercolor techniques. So the unique thing about these brush pens is that they have a brush on one end and then a fine point tip on the other end. So you can get some really nice details. So these are great for beginners because you get the best of both worlds. You get a nice fine point and then you also get an end that you can blend really well. Now, these are not going to be the individual brush tips like the markers we saw previously. These are going to be more like the marker we're using right now. Both ends are still completely water soluble. You can use them with watercolor techniques, and you can also use them as a calligraphy pen on its own. So just keep that in mind. You've got tons of options out there. Now, back to the video. But you can still, with those types of brush pens, you can still add water to it, okay? It still stains the paper just like the other brush markers do, okay? That's just what's going to happen if you don't start off with wet paper first. So even if I have these and I start off with wet, I'm just going to get a little puddle here. And then I go in with the brush. And these are crazy pigmented, like super crazy pigmented. What I like to do with this type of brush pen is I like to get a paint palette. So remember I told you the top of your paint palette that you get from me, the top of this one you can take off. What I like to do with these type of brush markers is I will put some of the brush and kind of scribble it here, add a little water, and you've basically made liquid watercolor with that. It's so fun to do. Let me show you. You can either use the top of your palette. So this is one that I've had. This is an old one, so it's got paint all over the place. Or you can use this paint palette. This is one where I was naughty and I did not clean out the ink that I had in there. But I'm going to use the white palette here so you can see it a little bit better. So like what I was saying, if you have a brush marker that has more of the marker in, you can essentially, like I said, kind of scribble in the palette. And I know you're like, what is the point of this? You go in and add water, and you've basically made watercolor. So if you're someone who maybe you want to like paint outside, this is a great option because these markers are so juicy. Again, this isn't something that's in my kit, but hey, you might have brush pens like this and you want to try it out. So you can do that method to where you're not having to bring like the actual paint palette. You can just have your brush markers that you have with you, and then you can just scribble them out in your palette, your different colors. You add a little bit of water, and then you've got watercolor, just like that. Lastly, we are going to talk about watercolor pencils. Again, if you want to buy the kit, I have the Crayola watercolor pencils in the kit. That's what I would always get my students. But you might find some other ones that you want to try. Maybe you don't get the kit. Maybe you just want to play around with some watercolor pencils. There are some different varieties that are out there, but don't feel like you have to spend a ton. If you want to, then go for it. It's your money. Again, do what you want. Now, there are some pencils by many different brands. This is the Derwent watercolor pencils. They come in this nice metal case. There's also these that I feel are the epitome of opulence because these were expensive. But again, I used a coupon. We love coupon life. So I think I may have got these from Michael's and got them on sale. But they are gorgeous colors. Gorgeous colors. If you are serious about watercolor pencils, like after you use these Crayola ones, and you are just like, I am living for this, then you should definitely consider some other watercolor pencils as well. This kit I haven't used as much because I have been obsessing over Inktense pencils and the Inktense blocks. So if you love working with watercolor, but you really want a punch of color and you want things to be crazy bold, these Inktense pencils have crazy pigment. So they're meant to be super, super pigmented and bold, just like ink would be, but you can still use water with them to blend them out, okay? So this is kind of like stepping it up from the Crayola watercolor pencils, all right? Now, when we start talking about these watercolor pencils, don't forget about blending materials together. Earlier, I talked about those Inktense pencils and the Inktense blocks. I love incorporating those with watercolor, and you can see that in these images. I absolutely love blending them together. So, any of the materials we're talking about, you can mix them together and see how they look. All right, back to the video. I'm going to use, because I don't want to mess these up from the kit, I am going to use the Derwent watercolor pencils just to show you what watercolor pencils do. The Crayolas, I promise you, will do basically the same thing. The only difference is these might not have the same, I don't think these have the same exact colors. Yeah, these are different colors than what you get with the Crayolas. And these might have a little bit more pigment, but it's not going to be too crazy. With watercolor pencils, the same techniques apply when it comes to whether or not you're doing a dry paper or a wet paper, okay? You can also blend along the way whenever using them. So I'm going to pick this darker purple here. So we're going to just start off with the paper's not wet at all up here. So when it comes to using these pencils, and this is with any pencil that you're using when you're drawing, always consider how you're holding your pencil. I know people hold their pencil in different ways. You might have different grips. That is totally fine. You hold the pencil what is most comfortable for you. What I want to focus on is how much pressure you're putting on the pencil, because that's going to affect how it looks on your paper. So the closer you are holding your pencil to the end, it's going to change the pressure on the paper, okay? So I'm holding the pencil farther back. See how it's like a lot lighter? This is the best when it comes to filling in larger areas of color. So let's say you were coloring something in with these watercolor pencils and you didn't want it to be super, super bold, then just hold it a little farther back, okay? So that way you can gently blend. That way, when you come back in with water, it's not going to look too crazy. So let me show you. So I'm going to do really hard defined marks. We'll kind of let up a little bit here and then even more here. So we've like lightly colored in an area, okay? I've removed some of the light over here just so you can see this a little bit better with the different ways we have added the pencil to the paper. So once again, I'm going to wet my brush. I'm going to use my round brush. So I'm going to start with this darker area first. So I'm going in and kind of blending out this color. So for the most part, we are getting rid of the pencil marks, but see how some of them still show through a little bit on the paper. What you're going to be tempted to want to do is to just keep going over it with your paintbrush. What that's going to do is you're going to start to see these little kind of little burrs of paper show up. And that's basically you starting to remove layers of the watercolor paper. And essentially you're tearing your paper and you don't want to do that. So if you're having to do that with the pencil, the watercolor pencil, that means you've pressed too hard. So this area is one we pressed kind of hard. It's a little difficult to see on camera, but I can tell I'm starting to tear the paper right there, and you really don't want that to happen. This next one here, we didn't press as hard with our pencil, and that means it's less effort to try to get this color to blend out. I'm going to wet my brush a little bit more. And notice how when you wet your brush more, it reactivates the color, okay? So we got a pretty good blend out with that by not pressing so hard. And again, this one down here, really lightly put on the paper. Minimal effort to get that to blend out, okay? So that's basically what you want when you're working with the watercolor pencils, you can kind of treat these a little bit like you would with a pencil. Let's say you had a drawing and maybe it's just some random shapes that you colored in with these very lightly. Remember, that's best. You could then go back in and just kind of use your water to blend it out. Now we're going to see what happens. We already have this nice and wet. We're going to see what happens when we layer on top of that. So I'm going to grab another pencil. This is already wet. Notice how you can still see the pencil marks. So this is already starting to dry a little bit. Let me grab some water. I'm going to re-wet this spot down here so you can see the difference. I'm going to add a little bit more water. So we've got almost dry, and then we've got a wet area. So see how it still doesn't blend out as much. Remember over here when the paper was wet, we could get it to blend out a little bit. It's going to be harder to blend out with pencils, okay? So I want you to see how it's almost exactly the same. So let's get a spot where we just have some water in this little corner here, and I'm going to immediately go in with my pencil. See, you can still see those watercolor pencil lines. Now, can I go back and blend? Definitely. You can still blend, but we're still going to have a few pencil marks on that. Same thing if I'm going back over this way, because I'm like, oh, I want to mix these colors together. Look at that. See those little pieces? Our paper is starting to tear, okay? We're getting too much water on here. We've added too much pressure. So see, this is something that I would show my students as well when I was teaching. They would really want to get in there and blend that color. But once you see this happening, you're starting to damage your paper, all right? That's why it's so important for you to work with some practice paper, okay? So like over here, these practice papers that I have, was perfect for you to start off with, the little practice papers, because I guarantee you, you're going to have some spots where you accidentally do this, where you accidentally put too much water and the paper starts to tear. But that's okay. It's part of the learning process, and it's part of learning about a new material. The last thing I want to talk about in the kit, and if you just have it on hand, are the two pencils. There's going to be two pencils in the kit, and this fine point Sharpie. So with this pencil, you might decide you want to, remember we were talking about pencil pressure, lightly draw with something first. So let's say maybe you just lightly draw in like a little flower or something on your paper. And then, oh, that's really light. I did it like so light, only I can tell it's there. But if you draw something super, super light and then you end up coloring it in with the watercolor, just know that you're still going to be able to see the pencil lines. Now for me, I did that so very light. Let me see if I can take, oh gosh, only I can see it. I'm so used to drawing nice and light. But again, if you do draw with pencil and you combine it with watercolor, you're still going to see it, okay? You can try to erase. I would not do that because you might start tearing your paper. Now, if it's dry, you can maybe erase it, but you've already kind of laid down pencil over there. So it's going to be hard to get rid of the pencil. Okay. So if you lightly, very lightly do it, you might be fine. But again, I want you to try it and see what happens. When it comes to the ultra fine point Sharpie pen that's in here, this is great for if you've already colored in something with the watercolor and maybe you want to draw on top. One of the things that I absolutely live by is doodling. I do have a video about what doodling is, and you can go back and watch that. But doodling is so great, and we're going to talk about it a lot on this channel because it really helps adults trying to get started with art. So you might have an area of watercolor that's already dry because maybe you've already made the shape for the flower, and then you can draw directly on top of that with the Sharpie. And then, you know, you've got the color behind it. Or maybe you just want to kind of doodle around and you just wanted a background for your doodling. Go for it, okay? Again, this whole situation is all about exploring what you can do. Now, with the Sharpie, let's say Let's try our little rushed doodly looking flower over here. So let's say we already have that on our paper and you're like, oh darn, I wanted to color that in. Well, you do have some of the pencils you could try to color it in with and add watercolor, or you could go straight up with your brush markers that you have, and you might go in with the brush marker and color it in, because now you have more of a precision point. Some people, whenever they are working with pan watercolor, I'm going to get a tiny brush here, wet with a little bit of water. Some people, when they first start with watercolor, they get a little stressed out when it comes to trying to control it. So I've got the little brush here, and then I'm just trying to go in inside the marker. That's why it's also great you have a tiny brush to work with. But some people might feel like working with a brush feels weird, and for some reason in your brain it feels like you can't get that precision even though you're using a smaller brush. Well, then it might be better for you to just go ahead and use the brush marker, because now your brain is telling you, oh, it's just a marker. And then you can just fill it in with the marker, and you might not even add water to that because maybe you want it to be that bold blue color. And that's totally fine as well. The one watercolor I did not go over was tube watercolor. I am not telling you to avoid this type of watercolor. It's not my favorite, but some people might like working with this tube paint. When I was doing adult art classes, this is the paint that people would want to avoid. So when it comes to the watercolor paint that's in a tube, you definitely want to have a palette, because you have to squeeze this into the palette so you can start using it. And some people think they need a ton of this to start off with. You really don't. You need smaller than a pea size, like super tiny, like just a little blot, because the water is what's going to make this spread across your page. Because remember, watercolor, water is your friend. I'm hoping by seeing some of these different watercolor materials, you can decide which ones you want to start with, or maybe even which ones you want to avoid. The biggest thing that I want you to remember is to explore and experiment. So sometimes you start with a new material, you think there's only one way that you can work with that material. Thank you for stopping by my channel today. Be sure to like and subscribe. You can also visit my website, www.bellagraffito.com, where you can see some of my original artwork and also purchase the watercolor class in a bag if you'd like. I also have a doodle class in a bag, so keep an eye out for that video so you can see some of the different things that come in there and the different things that you can create. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you in the next one.